I don't know how many of you are young enough or old enough to remember Huey Lewis and the News. Okay, there's at least one person. I remember their song, It's Hip to Be Square, a song that I loved, not only because it was super fun to dance to, but also because, well, frankly, I was a little square, and maybe still am, and I loved the fact that this song said it was hip to be square. What's not to love about a good role reversal? I mean, for years, books and movies, stories have played up on this theme of the expectation of certain things, and in fact, the opposite happens. So you think about things like Freaky Friday, or Parent Trap, or Tootsie, or Pride and Prejudice. All are stories in which people or ideas or expectations flip upside down for us. There's something deeply human about this kind of disruption because we are so susceptible to misjudging or misranking or misperceiving others. And those kinds of reversals invite us into deeper truths that can be revealed. Scripture is just chock full of these kinds of role reversals, and Jesus is a master of pointing them out and telling us to expect them. Time and time again, he tells us, well, it's this, but actually not quite. And today's teaching from Luke is no different. He offers this parable that tells us how radical humility is, how big it is to be humble. Let's set the scene. It's Sabbath. Jesus is dining at the home of a prominent Pharisee, and all the eyes in the room are on him. It's a world much like our own where hierarchies are paid attention to, but perhaps even more so because the masters were over servants, citizens over foreigners, priests above Pharisees, Pharisees at the high point of their powers. So if you were invited over to dinner at somebody's house, you would pay attention to those kinds of hierarchies, and the place where you sat at the table was determined by them. Those who had the higher rank usually seated next to others of high rank and near the host. Now, in this parable, Jesus has us notice how the guests are choosing places of honor for themselves. Maybe I can sneak up in rank just a little bit and take this seat. Or maybe I'm so important I ought to be in this seat. And Jesus takes this ordinary moment to offer an insight which is both incredibly socially savvy and full of spiritual insight. Socially savvy because he's telling us to avoid the shame of being asked to move down in rank. What could be more humiliating? Sorry, you're not that important. Somebody more important has come. Move over. He's suggesting that you'll actually garner more respect by sitting in a humble place, and, should it happen, be asked to move to a higher ranking spot. Now that's smart advice to be sure, but it is also gospel advice. Because from the gospel point of view, taking the last seat isn't just a social strategy. It's a spiritual one. Jesus is helping us to remember this deeper truth that he names in the scripture: all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. God's reign is not based on social rank or social ladders or any of our social strivings. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last in the reign of God. And Christians are repeatedly told that our task is to be servants, to place ourselves in the position of great humility at the end of the line, because that's where Jesus showed up. I learned bits of this type of humility from my mother. She lived a life of some of these contradictions. She was the daughter of a humble farmer, my grandfather, who also happened to have a PhD. Her roots were in the tiny, tiny town of Millet, where her great-grandfather was a relatively prominent member. Great-great-grandfather was a relatively prominent member of the community. He became so by importing wood from Wisconsin for the westward expansion. She was the niece of a conscientious objector, but married a career military officer. She scrimped and saved, raising 4 kids on a military salary, but used that platform to enable us all to experience the world, countries, natural wonders, cultures, and art as much as we could. She used to say that all these combinations helped her to feel at home in any crowd. It made her both keenly aware of the subtleties of social ranking, but also very joyful to be wherever it was that she was, and keenly interested in people and the world around her. Jesus invites us into that kind of humility that is joyful and full of wonder. It's not self-deprecation or false modesty. It is rather the joy of being with others who are also made in God's image. Joy that at moments we experience what is different from us, and joy that sometimes we are simply comfortable at home with our own. We humans love rank, but God does not. And frankly, the best of ourselves doesn't love it either. So throughout Scripture, we see God pushing back against all the social hierarchies and structures that we create for ourselves. God resists the idea of temples and shrines. God warns the Israelites not to lift up kings. God calls prophets to keep kings and religious authorities in check. In Jesus, God placed spiritual wisdom in the populace and undermined religious authority. God knows the human tendency to idolize power, to want to inhabit it and lord it over others, but God warns us time and time again that such power corrupts. And Torah law reminds us that those who think above themselves above law will in time be brought low. Jesus echoes this wisdom, so he tells us to choose humility, and then shows us with his own life the way he walked through the world in a humble fashion, shows us how we might choose the way of humility ourselves. Because when we choose that kind of humility, we start to see the world as infused with God's presence. We start to see everyone before us as made in the image of God. No matter their beliefs, their behaviors, their background, every single person is a potential teacher, a vessel of grace for us to receive, a potential reflection of Christ. Well, this reminds me of a song by Nicole Nordeman. The lyrics, one section of them: "When I met her in a bookstore, she was browsing on the first floor through a yoga magazine, and she told me in her past life she was some plantation's slave wife, and she had to figure out what that might mean. I turned and walked away and laughed at what she had to say, then casually dismissed her as a fraud. I forgot that she was created in the image of my God." That's the danger of pride. It's not that we think too much of ourselves. It's that we begin to think too little of others. We forget that God's image is in all those who are around us. We overlook their sacredness because we get too busy sorting and judging and categorizing others. Humility is a spiritual discipline. It's an essential way of being for those who want to follow Jesus, for it teaches us to see more in others, to see more of others, to see God in others. The truth is, your soul cannot expand to the fullness of Christ's expectations for us when we are busy sorting rank. But when we choose humility, when we take the last seat at the table, something amazing happens. We make space for God to lift us up. And we begin to see the sacredness in everyone we meet.